Hello everyone, this is the sixth in the series of High Holiday Controversial Davenings, and today I'd like to deal with saying the words in the Machzor or in the Slichot books when we have a state of Israel, as I will explain. And I'd like to dedicate all the words of Torah I'm about to say to a great woman who was taken from us yesterday, B'Seiva Tova, Rebetin Miriam Amital, Zichrona Livracha. Rebetin Amital was married to my great Rebbe, Rav Yehuda Amital, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. She herself was the daughter of great Gedolim, the daughter of Rav Tzvi Yehuda Meltzer, who was the Rav of Rehovot, and granddaughter of Rav Yisrael Zalman Meltzer, everyone Zichronim Tzadikim Livracha. Much of my years in yeshiva was spent not only with my great Rebbeim, but with their wives as well. Many Friday nights I was at their table, and I heard her very quiet and beautiful words of wisdom, always given over in a very subtle, nice, pleasant way. And more importantly, the topic that we're going to deal with is exactly the story of the Amital family. Rav Yehuda Amital, a Shoah survivor, is literally the story of the state of Israel, coming of the ashes of the Holocaust, and within a few years seeing Israel come about, fighting in the War of Independence, and eventually creating a huge yeshiva that I was privileged to learn in. Many episodes and many stories come to mind, but I just want to say one that I think goes right into the topic that we're going to deal with. When my other great Rebbe, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, passed away, Rebetin Amital came to pay a shiva call. She sat down, and the two Rebetins, Rebetin Dr. Tover Lichtenstein and Rebetin Amital, looked at each other, and Rebetin Lichtenstein said to Rebetin Amital, Hitzlachnu, we succeeded. We took a little tiny yeshiva in the old barracks of the Jordanian army, and we made it into a great institution. And she shook her head. And then they had a fight. Who had it harder? Who had it harder in the early years of the yeshiva? Rebetin Amital insisted that it was Rebetin Lichtenstein, and Rebetin Lichtenstein, of course, insisted on the opposite, saying, you were there at the beginning when you were in barracks. We came a few years later, there were better conditions. To which Rebetin Amital said, yes, there were better conditions when you came in 1971. But you have to remember, we came from a primitive Jerusalem. You came from New York City, and that gap was very hard to bridge. So in her honor, all the words of Torah I'm about to say that are very relevant to the story of Israel, Slichos, and everything we're about to talk about, I'd like to dedicate to Miriam ben Rav Tzvi Yehuda, Zichrona Livracha. There is a Gemara in Masechet Yoma, Daf Samech Tet Amud Bet, Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vahanora. These are the words that are written in the Torah and ultimately made it into our davening. Came along Yirmiyahu Hanavi, seeing the destruction of the temple, and says, how can I say the words Norah when they're destroying God's temple? Came along Daniel Hanavi, who's sitting in Golus, and says, how can I say Ata Gibor L'Olam Hashem if the Jewish people are in exile? Ayek Vurotav. And indeed, the Gemara there says that maybe you should say it, because why? God is sort of silent. God is sort of holding his hands tight, tying them, as you will, and allowing all this to happen. In the words of the Gemara, Shenoten erech hapayim la reshaim. And that is showing that God indeed is great. So we have a Gemara that says there's words that are very hard to say, but quite frankly, we can explain them in a certain way and still say them. However, the Gemara says not everyone agreed. After all, Rabbanon hechiavi hachi v'akira tekanta dekatitakin Moshe. How indeed did the majority opinion come along and say, hey, we can go along and change the words of Moshe Rabbeinu. Amar Rabbi Elazar, says Rabbi Elazar, Mitoch sheyodim ba'kadosh baruch hu shamitihu, since we know God is true and his whole name is truth, lefikach lo kizvubo, they can't say a lie in front of God. From this perspective, when you look throughout the Machzor and the Siddur and the Slichos books, you will find various passages that should bother you. And I encourage you to do this because that is the halacha. The halacha is, in Simon Kuf in Shulchan Aruch, Tfilot Shel Moadot, the holiday davenings, Tzarich lahasdir tfilato Kodem sheyitpalel, you should go over them before davening, namely don't wait till Rosh Hashanah, but do it before Rosh Hashanah. Don't wait till Yom Kippur, do it before, and don't wait till Slichos and Shul, do it before Slichos. Why? Kadesh teyesh gura befiv, so you know what you're saying. So if indeed you open up, say, Neila, or the Slichos, you will find a few passages that seem not to actually express the reality that, thank God, we're living in. For example, Ha'ir HaKodesh v'Hamechozot, the holy city and the suburbs, Hayule Cherpa ulevizot, have become a disgrace and have been looted. V'chol Machamadeh Tvuot ugnuzot, and all her treasures have been buried and hidden. Ve'ein shiur rak haTorah azot, and the only thing we have left is the Torah. So we have a passage that ultimately says that the holy city of Jerusalem is a disgrace and has been looted. Anyone visiting Jerusalem today will see that that is not the case. And to end with the passage, Ve'en shiur rak haTorah azot, all we have left is the Torah, obviously referring to the Gemara that in this world Hashem is only found in Daled Amot Shel Halacha, in the 4 cubits of learning Halacha, that also is not true today. Thank God, Meloch Haaretz Kvodo is not yet there, but Baruch Hashem, if you look in Israel today, many of the wonderful prophecies of our prophets have come true, from the land bearing fruit to the Jerusalem being more built than ever, having more people living there than ever. So, to say this passage seems to be a lie. Now you could say part of this passage and say, okay, Kol Machamadeh Tvuot ugnuzot, we still don't have the treasures of the Aron, the famous Aron that was in the Beis HaMikdash or whatnot, but the whole passage seems to be rather irrelevant. Let's take another example, also from Slichos, and we repeat it in Neila. Eskera Elokim v'hemaya, shall remember God and I shall moan. Biroti kol ir al tilav bnuya, when I see every other city built, but the city of God, namely Jerusalem, is degraded to the nethermost depth. I don't see the city of Jerusalem, as it says, degraded to the nethermost depth. As a matter of fact, I see it more built than ever. So how do we say these passages? So this takes us back to a debate of a different day in our calendar, and that of course is Tisha B'Av, and specifically saying the passage called Nachem. In that passage it refers to Jerusalem as an ir, as a city that's Avela, Chareva, Bzuya, Veshomima. It is a city that is in mourning, a city that is totally destructed, and many other adjectives along these lines. So in that particular context, there was a machlokus between Gedolei HaPoskim after the 6-Day War, when Jerusalem got back to our hands, and thank God it began to be rebuilt. What should we do? And there were a group of poskim that came along and said, we have to change Nachem, and they suggested various different changes. Rav Shlomo Gorin said that indeed, a year after the 6-Day War in 1968, he wrote a tshuva that you have to say in Tisha B'Av the beginning of Nachem and the end of Nachem, but the middle, he says, you have to totally not say the middle the way it's written because of the changes that happened. And indeed, he proposed a nusach, as did others. Rav Chaim David Alevi, a little more conservative with a small c, said, all you have to do is say, Ha'ir shehaita avila. It used to be destructed and in mourning and whatnot. Well, on the other hand, there were poskim that said, don't change it. Rav Shlomo Goren himself, actually in a later tshuva, says that even though he said to change it, because of the Yom Kippur War, because we had this terrible thing called the Oslo Agreements in which we recognized the Palestinian Authority, he says that after all of these things happening, and any ro'es siba leshanot fusim kayamim, leave Nachem the way it is. Rav Soloveitchik felt that halachically, the city is considered desolate until there's a Beis HaMikdash. Rav Ovadia Yosef also said not to change Nachem for 3 reasons. Number 1, we don't change things that Anshe Knesset Hagdola went ahead and actually wrote. Number 2, the reason that Rav Soloveitchik gave that I just presented. And number 3, he says that Jerusalem is not yet where it should be spiritually. My own Rebbe, Rav Aharon Lichtenstein, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, had a suggestion that I personally adopted, and that is to leave out the irrelevant lines. Don't change, but leave out the lines that are no longer relevant. No plugging this in to our Slichos, we actually do have literature about our Slichos. The Bach comes along and says that you better daven Neila on time, because if you don't daven Neila on time, and you start davening Neila too late into the day, then how can you say the piyut that starts with the words Hayom Yifneh, the day will change, Hashemesh Yavo Yifneh, the sun will go down and change, or Kipanayom, if you're going to say it at night? After all, if it already happened, how can you say it's about to happen? That if not, Bakashato plaster umechse keshikra, your words are an absolute lie. And indeed, the Magen Avraham repeats this and says, indeed, you're dover shkarim lifnei Hashem. You're not just lying, you're not lying before God. The Aruch HaShulchan comes along and says, indeed, in the Slichos, there are various passages that talks about the time you're saying it, that we say, Beza'akam ba'od layel, we're screaming out to you, God, when it's still night. Well, if you're saying it during the day, how can you say those words? Oh, ba'ashmoret haboker. You say the words ashmoret haboker, I'm screaming out to you, but it's not ashmoret haboker anymore. And therefore, in those places, if you're saying it during the day and not at night, have dover shkarim, v'lachen yedalgu tevot elu, and therefore you should skip it. And that's what I personally suggest to people. In other words, when you get to these passages, be it in the Slichos or in the Neila, skip the irrelevant passages. We are not talking about the Amital per se, we're talking about the piyutim. And in the piyutim, I believe we have an absolute right, not to mention an obligation, to skip what's not relevant. The piyutim were there to enhance davening, and it's laughable that we're enhancing davening with words that are not true. So to sum up, some people will say what it says in the Machzor and the Slichos, like they say Nachem on Tisha B'Av, explaining it in various different ways. Others will either change it. I don't know anyone that does, but I personally would advise to skip it. And thank God.
I